Sounds perfect. All right, well, then let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second and final part of the 28th Annual Graduate Interdisciplinary Conference. So many of you know me. For those of you who don't, my name is Ellen Dobrowolski, and I'm a PhD student in the Department of Religion and Cultures. And
I'm Katrina Kardash, and I'm a second-year master's student in the Department of Religions and Cultures at Concordia.
we are your co-chairs for this event and for all the AGIC events for this year. So first, we would like to begin by acknowledging that Concordia University is located on unceded Indigenous lands. AGIC's activities, by extension, are organized and held on these unceded lands. The Kanien'kehá:ka Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters on which we gather today. AGIC is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations, and today it is the home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. In an effort to combine this verbal acknowledgement with further constructive action, we would like to invite participants to support the activities of the First Peoples Justice Center of Montreal. And you can see a link to the center's website can be found in the chat box now. So thank you.
We'd also like to thank everyone who joined us for day one of the conference last Thursday. A special thank you to Professor Miranda Crowdis, who delivered a keynote address that brought together the two components of this year's theme, religion performed, in a wonderfully engaging, sensorial way. So unfortunately, Professor Crowdis can't be here today, but she will be watching the recording. So we continue the interdisciplinary exploration that we began last week using a format that has become quite familiar, the virtual meeting. So thank you for logging on. One advantage of this format, as we noted last week, is that it allows us to overcome geographic boundaries among other limitations and to come together as a community of learners. So we hope you'll enjoy today's program. In the first hour, we'll be hearing from Professor Selby, our keynote speaker, and we'll have some time for questions, discussion. We'll take a short break and we'll move on to our Ritual Matters panel, which will be moderated by Ali Smears, past AGIC chair. So please note that you can use the chat box to submit questions during the meeting by clicking on the chat icon at the bottom of the Zoom window. This meeting is also being recorded, so if you would prefer not to appear on camera, you can just keep your camera off. And you can communicate directly with Ellen or I, the meeting host. If you have any technical issues, we'll do our best to assist you. So that concludes my remarks.
Yes, our technical housekeeping, yes. Okay, and so now it's our pleasure to introduce Dr. Jennifer A. Selby. Dr. Selby is the graduate coordinator and associate professor at Memorial University, cross-appointed in religious studies and political science, and affiliated with the Department of Gender Studies. Her research grapples with configurations of secularism in France and Quebec. She is currently principal investigator of the Secularism on the Move project and is a visiting researcher in 2022-23 at the CIRRES at the University of Montreal. So everyone, please welcome Jennifer Selby.
Hi, thank you so much. Thanks everyone for being here. I'm going to share my screen. All right. Can everyone hear me okay? Yes, great. So thank you so much to Katrina and Ellen for the invitation. I'm really thrilled to be here. This is a topic that has been very generative for me to think about performance. So I really appreciate and I'm grateful for the invitation. All right, I'm going to just launch into it. So this is the title of my talk, Demands for a Secular Body, Analyzing Requirements and Performances in France and Quebec. So over the next 40 minutes or so, I'm going to take you on a journey to hopefully impel to you or convince you why you should care about secularism and what I'm calling the secular body. or as like my 7-year-old would say, what are you even talking about? So I'm hoping that by the end, you'll have a sense of what I'm talking about. I'm going to tell you a little bit about method and theory that undergirds this project. So methodologically, I rely on discourse analysis of bills and legislation on secularism and immigration in France and Quebec, and on ethnographic data, where I draw on 2 sources of data. And I'm going to just introduce a handful of participants from these 2 projects. But the first project is based on 187 interviews that I conducted between 2011 and 2019 with individuals of Algerian origin who live outside of Paris and in Montreal regarding their matrimonial practices and their transnationalism. My goal there was to look at laws and interactions with them governing marriage and immigration as contact zones for which to examine secularism. And the second body of data are 65 interviews I've conducted to date with my colleague Amélie Barras at the York University, with individuals of French origin who identify as secular, who have migrated to Montreal. Specifically, we're asking them about their views and experiences regarding secular politics in Quebec. And we're hoping to conduct another 15 interviews this spring. So we're still, that work is still in progress. More theoretically, I rely primarily on the burgeoning field of secularism studies. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I'm going to call secular sensibilities in France and Quebec. And my conclusion, if you have to leave early or you get drawn into online shopping or whatever is going on for you, is that the secular body in France and Quebec is increasingly focused on gender. I'm going to argue that it insists on a cisgender binary and really privileges a male and heteronormative gaze, especially on the sexual visibility of cis-het women. I'm going to say that these circumstances are more clearly defined in France than in Quebec, but that we can observe important similarities between the 2 contexts. Okay, I forgot to put my timer on. So, okay. So you're probably already aware of political calls to protect secularism, particularly in the face of radicalism and domestic terrorism in France. A few examples can kind of highlight some of these tensions and ironies. So as you all are aware, in Quebec, since the passage of Law 21 in 2019, we've seen some tensions around the determination of religious symbols, whether they're acceptable or not. The covering of religious tattoos is a really interesting site of this tension. And here we can see, right, this is a constituent who is showing Premier François Legault, his tattoo of Premier François Legault. But there are a number of other kind of more religious tattoos that I think are interesting sites. They're interesting because they've been largely overlooked by this law, where religious symbols are mostly understood as detachable, externalized, easily privatized forms of belief. More importantly, I'm going to show you, hopefully, that tattoos do not disturb mainstream secular sensibilities. Similarly, in France, we've seen most recently a passage of a 2021, what's called a separation law, that goes further than 2004 and 2011 laws against conspicuous religious symbols. This 2021 law now bans hijabs for all minors, burkinis in public pools. And I really want you to note behind President Emmanuel Macron in this photo, you can see the picture of Marianne. So this is from a very famous Delacroix painting, Liberty for the People, which is a key symbol of secularism in France. So I just want you to notice her. We're going to come back to her in a moment. So in opposition to these restrictions, these legal restrictions we've seen recently on religious bodies, I want to ask in my work and in this talk today, how are desirable secular bodies imagined? What sensibilities are negotiated and performed? I reflect on these 2 questions primarily indirectly, by examining two areas of contact. So as I mentioned, the first, civil marriage of national and non-national couples in France and Quebec. And secondly, the experiences of secular bodies of mostly white French men and women who live in Montreal. In other words, if we admit that laïcité or secularism is not only an abstract principle, what are its effective forces? What is the emancipated secular body according to the logic of these laws? How do these sensibilities manifest themselves into people's lives and experiences? So before I turn into some of my ethnographic data, I'm going to show you this slide, which is kind of an overwhelming slide, but my goal here is to really try to show you how there's a kind of way in which these three contexts, so the federal level in Canada, the Quebecois context, and the French context, how there are actually moments in which there are synergies in the secular legislation between these three places. I include the Canadian context, the broader federal context, because in other work, I'm trying to show how it's not necessarily that different from the Quebecois context, actually. I can come back to this slide later if anyone's interested in looking at the specificities. I also focus in this work and in this talk on the post-2008 moment, because it's really beginning in 2008 that we start to see a hyper-focus on the niqab in all three contexts. And I'm going to argue that the niqab is a real flashpoint for the installation and the kind of articulation of secular sensibilities. One of the things I'm trying to argue is that there's an increasingly prescriptive and a required proof of secularism, especially on some bodies, a clear legibility on the body that we can chart. That's kind of becoming increasingly required, we can say, in these legislative contexts. At the same time as these laws have been happening, there are an increased number of self-described secular people in France and Quebec. So this is some data that my colleague Sarah Wilkins-Laflamme has shared with me. This is coming from France. So from 2018, now we see the non-religion or the secular people are about 58% of the population. Significantly also since 2008 is that the French are now one of the largest, if not the largest, immigrant group to Quebec. And at the same time, as I'm sure you're all well aware, the imagination of religion and the people's identification with certain religious groups has also changed. We know from the 2021 census data that now we have this 27% of Quebecois now identify as non-religious, up from 12% 10 years ago, and significantly, right, this drop of Catholicism from 75 to 54%. The point being that the secular body is the kind of discourse around it is happening in a moment in which there are an increasing number of secular people. Before I turn to how I conceptualize the secular body, I want to briefly situate what I mean by secularism. So there are three dimensions in particular I want to highlight, and there are thousands of definitions that circulate around secularism. So this, to me, are the three most significant in my work and in the specific context in which my work is located. So first and most obviously, secularism is always imbricated with religion. On this point, I really like the political scientist Beth Hurd's definition, where she says more or less that secularism is a contingent series of legal and political projects that define and manage religion. So religion is central to secular politics and legislation. Secondly, I'm really interested in why secular nation states care so much about religious bodies and cis-het women's religious bodies in particular. I argue that in France and increasingly in Quebec, secularism is positioned as essential to cisgendered women's rights, particularly focused on a kind of narrow idea of female sexual emancipation. So in this way, the secular framework renders gender. And I'm really interested also in the experiences of men. And I'm going to give some examples of how this also implicates men. And lastly, that secularism is a tool of governmentalities, that secularisms can justify the rationality and equality, so-called, of white settler politics based on Christian notions of terra nullius. And so more generally, all of these ideas together, I'm increasingly convinced of thinking about secularism as an episteme, as a way in which we can understand how gender and race are framed. I'm not going to talk too much about this, but certainly one way we can think about secularism in these two contexts, in France and in Quebec, is that I found kind of most, maybe not that surprising among my French participants here in Montreal, has been the Christianness of secular rituals. So one of the things that I've asked my participants to date is, what are your French rituals when you are in Montreal or in Toronto? And invariably, no matter their religious background or not, very Christian ideas come up about what are French rituals. So especially surrounding food, not surprisingly, because these are delicious things, also very glutinous things, but so not everyone can eat them, but the galette des rois and Chandeleur just happened recently in February. So we see the way in which this kind of notion of Frenchness supersedes or extracts the Catholicness of these rituals. And so that one of our participants, who is a Muslim man, 39, father of 3 children, he even said, quote, "We're not, let's say, Catholic Christians, but we have to have these French traditions at home." And so these French traditions for him are these Catholic ones that are evacuated of their Catholicness. But I think tells us a lot about how Christian rituals become secularized. Just another example. Going on to thinking about the secular body, so we can think of a lot of examples, I think, of like kind of ritual life, but for me, most interesting is a kind of habitus of the secular, how these ideas become instilled on the body. So in this way, like forms of religiosity, secularisms similarly have a range of social and physical dispositions. So a number of cultural and political theorists, historians and anthropologists like Talal Asad, pictured here, Saba Mahmoud, Nadia Fadel, William Connolly, have been critically engaging this idea of the secular body. Assad argues that the secular body's normativity and invisibility are what grant it power. So he says, unless you knew someone well, you couldn't tell whether she was a believer, like a secular believer, or not, merely by the way she spoke or behaved. What does this tell us about the secular body? One answer may be that religious belief, where it exists among liberal moderns, is so deeply repressed that it has at best a very tenuous connection with observable behavior. So what Assad is saying in this work, and William Connolly also takes up in some of his work, is that the secular body's expectations are concealed and therefore immunized from challenge. They're really kind of banal, if you will. They're just part of the everyday. However, I would argue against this point that in contemporary France and Quebec, there is something else happening. My data is showing something else happening, that there's increasingly a desire, a prescriptive demand for proof of secularity, a clear legibility on the body. And this is especially true for folks who are racialized or who appear to be or are religious. I saw that Thomas Seivel's on the call from Memorial. So hi, Thomas. We read this book together in a course. So here I'm referencing it. It's called Make Yourselves Gods, a brilliant book by Peter Coviello, in which he thinks about the secular body by with reference to how Mormons in the 19th century in America abandoned polygamy, and in so doing became white, monogamous, and patriarchal, but also secular. So he draws on queer theory, and Coviello argues that once they were recognized as sexually, quote unquote, normal, 19th century Mormons became white, became secular. This whiteness was not based on their rejection only of polygamy, but also their unquestioning embrace of patriarchal power relations. He also has this great ironic description in his book that I think is just kind of funny, where he describes who is a secular person. And he says, I'm just got to move my little pane here. The secular person can be imagined as dressing in, quote, respectable guises, speaks in an ordinary, even critical voice. Their posture is neutralist, cognitive, cogitative, deflating, and always faintly condescending. And to this, I would add a number of other aspects that I've noted when I think about like, what is the idealized secular body? Again, also a consumer, rational, often white, but not necessarily monogamous, and equating sexual freedom with the visual access to women's bodies. I'm going to come back to that. Other theorists who've done some work on secular sensibilities that I think are just also very undercited. So I always want to emphasize their work in my own work. These folks are Nada Fadel, who talks about secular sensibilities, Nuala Fergole, who draws on Bourdieu to talk about habitations of the secular, and Shirin Amir Moazzami, who talks about secular embodiments in her work. So again, I tried to draw on their work, but I don't think that they go quite far enough in showing the prescriptiveness increasingly in these contexts around the performance of secular sensibilities. So now I'm going to kind of shift gears a little bit away from the theory to look at some of the legislative contexts. So in the first point I'm trying to make around the secular French body is the importance of the rejection of the niqab in its conceptualization of the idealized secular body. So here I'm drawing on this 668-page report that was produced and led by André Gérin in France. This preceded the law against niqabs in France. And here, I think we can see, especially in my work on the secular body in the Francophonie, so looking at Quebec, France, Belgium, and Switzerland, we see this kind of similar kind of intonation, less sharply in Quebec, admittedly, but where the niqab impedes seduction, a kind of male gaze. So here is André Rossineau, the mayor of Nancy, who says, with the voile intégral, with the niqab, women are not free to show themselves, to exist on the exterior, and this is my emphasis, even less to seduce. So there's this sense in which the niqab is impeding a kind of heteronormative male gaze. Another interesting way to think about the French secular body is in its emphasis on this notion of seduction. And Joan Wallach-Scott, a historian, has taken up this point of the French secular body as sexualized and available. So she, in her 2011 book, you can see it here, The Fantasy of Feminist History, captures the kind of patriarchal and nation-building aspects of France that are related to seduction and romance. And I would extend these kind of tropes into thinking about secularism in France as well. So Scott argues that seduction, forgive me, serves to mask difference when there is no possibility of parity between men and women. So it's this kind of notion of seduction falsely is presented as a marker of gender equality and as civility, but that this seduction actually masks the existing opposition or the problem of hierarchies and the way in which equality is actually not available, is kind of masking these gendered hierarchies in demonstrating and trying to demonstrate this kind of civility and deference to women and women's bodies. So some of the contours of this idealized French secular body are more specific than in the Quebecois context that I'm going to turn to in a moment. The urgency of its protection is especially heightened in moments in France related to terrorism. So this is when we start to see a kind of concern for the visibility of secular bodies, especially. So this poster, and I'm going to just move to the chat for a moment so that I can, let me just see. I know it's quite small. I just have to stop sharing for a sec, I think, so I can share. Here's a link to the poster. So you can see it yourself because it's quite small here on the screen. But this poster was published by the French government, François Hollande's government in 2015 after the horrible terrorist attacks in Paris in November. And it's trying to demonstrate what are some warning signs for radicalization that everyone should be aware of. So often you see signs around in Paris, like Vigile Pirate, like watch out, be on the lookout. And, there are some kind of more, the images kind of betray a little bit more subtlety in the written part, but you can see here, one of the warning signs is changing eating habits. So that's why the baguette, right? If you're, this is a sign of radicalization. Also showing kind of swimming practices, heightened space also for the secular body, in that burkinis have been outlawed now formally since this poster was circulating. And a real focus on appropriate femininity, especially on the length of dresses. So we see a lot of concern around the niqab debates as well, about especially racialized Maghrebian or North African origin women, if their skirts are too long, what this could tell us about their potential, maybe not radicalization, but their potential deviance from or excess in terms of appropriate sexuality. We see these kinds of differentiations also of secular sensibilities, especially heightened with the banlieue. So the banlieue are the external areas to the large urban centers, also kind of hotbeds for problematic secular sensibilities. And here's a poster from the National Front, the right-wing party, highlighting a kind of difference, like which version do you want? And again, focused on a young woman. Importantly, the woman on the left who has a red cap on, this is a real nod to Marianne, who has this, often wears this special hat in the French Revolution. And then you see also, interestingly, that the woman wearing niqab appears to be white, which is also, a huge problem for the secular body. Are white bodies that wear niqabs are especially flagrant. And then lastly, this is a poster that accompanied the 2011 law to show the face. So, La République se vit à visage découvert, that is like, we have to be able to see the face. And here again, we start to see Marianne, who's really visible as an image of idealized the secular body, I would argue. She's often, she's white, she's young, she's often got her hair kind of flowing, and usually to a greater or lesser extent, we see her breasts. So here, even in kind of busts, it's her breasts are always kind of visible. And I think that that's important to note when we think about the idealized secular body. Now I'm going to turn to the 2013, this one you're all familiar with, the pictogram that accompanied Bill 60, which, as you know, did not pass. But I would say that in terms of the interviews I did in Montreal with folks of Algerian origin, it was really Bill 60 that has remained with them, even though it didn't pass, because of this pictogram. And I'm going to refer to one of my participants, Walid, in a moment, who's going to talk about the importance of this pictogram. But here we see the pictogram also references the French differentiation in its 2004 law between discrete and visible or ostentatious religious symbols. Again, important for us to note is how idealized secularism is always focused on the body, very visually focused, that symbols are always seen as stable and uniform. That the folks or the people here depicted in this color image are a white beige color or are unracialized. I think that that's not an accident. It kind of then makes them not seem like real individuals. I think that if we didn't have these mannequins here, but if the real people's faces were used in this pictogram for the forbidden or the unacceptable religious signs, that they would have been more associated with the impact on racialized Quebecers who have had, we all know, a disproportionately negative impact on them. and that if we had seen real people wearing religious symbols, it would have really humanized, I think, the impact and captured more of the intersecting dimensions of inclusion and exclusion. So I'm going to briefly turn now to some of my ethnographic data to further chart how these ideas of secular bodies map onto people's experiences and lives. So the first site of my first project is a banlieue of Paris. So here you can see a map with all the sites. If you've ever visited Paris, they're depicted here. And on the left, you see a little blue dot that says Défense, La Défense. And the field site that where I've done field work since 2004 is called Petit-Nanterre, and it's just a few kilometers from La Défense. So here's a picture of it. There are about 8,800 inhabitants in this particular suburb, most of whom are first-generation folks, and many of whom are of Algerian origin for a number of reasons, owing to migration patterns, and that, anyway, I can get into those details if anyone's interested. So I conducted 96 interviews here, and one of the things that really interested me when I was doing my doctoral work that I didn't take up in that initial field work were the number of people who were interested in or seeking out marriage partners who were of Algerian origin, even if they were second or third generation folks of Algerian origin, even if they didn't share a common language. And that really in the face of laws that were really curtailing starting in 2016 and heightened in 2011 and then in 2021, trying to curb these transnational marriages. So for example, I'm kind of going over this really quickly, and there are important differences also between Montreal and France in how this marriage partner preference works. But for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to introduce you to one interlocutor, Amel, who's 25, and I attended her July 2016 wedding in Ghazawet, Algeria, and I used these photos with her permission. And so there are a number of reasons why she seeks or to follow Mektoub or destiny and decides to seek out a transnational groom. Anyway, but one of them I think is partially her cosmopolitanism. She's really interested in kind of an Algerian France life. Also, her father and eldest brother had transnational Petit-Nanterre Ghazawet marriages. Here's her groom. This is an arranged marriage. So here you can see his mother and aunt are feeding him milk and dates with great sadness because, of course, their wedding means his departure from Algeria. For his younger siblings, this marriage is a great thing. It brings them a lot of social capital, and also the expectation is that Yassine will, and he has done, send remittances from France for them. And so now this couple has settled in France. Okay, so the reason I'm telling you about them is because of this heightened concern. And here is Pascal Clément, the then Minister of Justice in France, who talks about the problem with these transnational non-EU migrant marriages, that he claims that 1/3 of marriages now in France are with this category of people for whom then citizenship is at stake, right, is possible. And so, right, so we had this law in 2006, gets sharpened in 2011, and again sharpened again in 2021. I'm going to show you a memorandum that was circulated to marriage officiants in France, which I think really captures some of the logic within what I'm trying to imagine as a secular, idealized secular body, and how those are visible in the marriage ceremony. So an important thing to realize, though, is that in France, you can't get married on a beach or in a tree or wherever people get married in your backyard. You have to get married at a mayor's office, or a state representative has to be there in a city hall. So the state has a lot of purview over who's marrying whom and how it's taking place. So this is a screenshot from this memorandum. It's a 22-page memorandum. And this is a list of questions that marriage officiants should pose to people who are, who are engaging in this kind of transnational non-EU set up. And I would argue that the kinds of questions that are being posed separately to them are trying to assess things like their knowledge of one another, especially their sexual intimacy, asking details about the ceremony, the atmosphere, mood, who paid for the rings, as well as the couple's previous living arrangements. And in addition to the segregated questioning, we also see that the surveillance continues with a follow-up visit to couples' homes in the first 5 years of their marriage to assess, again, proper intimacy. Officials now have actually up to 30 years to annul a marriage deemed fraudulent without the acceptable level of intimacy. So in my reading, this memorandum defines a performatory secular romance, a kind of imagination of the proper sexual intimacy, and that these can be cues of proper French sexual behavior and then citizenship. Marriage without these signs, so like couples like Amel and Yassine, they don't have sexual or financial intimacy prior to their wedding. So they were very, very nervous. Before going to the French consulate in Oran, Yassine actually shaved his beard, which I think was also a desire to become more secularized, if you will. Anyway, all of this kind of hypervigilance creates these ways in which people then engage with the state. I would say that these expectations of romance become proxies, if you will, for proper sexual politics. And that proper sexual politics does not include a religious body, especially one that is engaged in an arranged transnational marriage. In another example, I'm trying to kind of pull some examples from men. The examples with women are, as you can imagine, women are kind of stylizing themselves in a book project. I talk about how, women put on red lipstick, they're careful with their eyeliner, just ways in which makeup also are ways in which these young women are engaging with what I would call kind of imagined secularism. But here, Elias, I'm going to introduce you to very briefly. I thought his example was really interesting because he, in many ways, flips the script around the state's requirements for romance, because he assesses that an arranged marriage is more rational than one based on passion. So Elias has a very difficult childhood. He's an orphan. And when it becomes clear that he might enter into the neighborhood's prolific and important drug trade, at 14, his grandparents send him to Algeria, to rural Kabylia, to set him straight. And he says that this trip to the bled, or which is Arabic for home country, impacts him a lot, impacts his choices. And so he says that he wants to procéder autrement, procéder religieusement. He wants to proceed differently, proceed religiously. Where he had been dating women more casually, he decides he wants to have afterwards an arranged marriage. And so he thinks a little bit about how this, as he says, this religious approach is more rational, he says, than the kind of imagined state approach. At the same time, I would say that governmentality still lingered in his marriage options and in his marriage, in who he chose to marry, in that he was really careful to choose someone who already had French citizenship, because there also can be a fear of marriage fraud, of what the French call escroquerie sentimentale à but migratoire, or love fraud with a migratory aim. And so, of course, these kinds of fears also instill in how people make determinations around their marriage partners, including for who I call Elias. So most interesting for me was how he astutely rejected the logic undergirding these laws, that romance and individual choice safeguard against love fraud, and that traditional arranged marriages are anathema to love and individual choice. So he does some research online with some Muslim thinkers and consults different folks. And he determines that this kind of religiously guided choice is far superior than an imagined romantic love sought union that is being sought out in these state-sanctioned weddings. I also wanted to give a very different example from fieldwork that I conducted in Montreal. So the Montreal fieldwork I did is quite different, obviously, than in the French case, in that Algerians live across the city. There's no kind of one Algerian neighborhood. Even in the Petit Maghreb, only 13.9% of Algerians live in that neighborhood. So it's much more dispersed, which also tells us a lot about Algerian immigration to the city. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about Walid, who was 47 when I interviewed him. He migrated initially with permanent residency in 2006 and initially had trouble finding good work in Montreal. So worked in a call center, made some money, took a business diploma here in Quebec, and then found better employment. Then his mother said, you know, come back to Algeria, see what destiny brings. And for her, that meant time to find a wife. And so he returns to Algeria, has an arranged marriage, brings Farida back with him in 2008. No issues, even though also in Canada, we have laws in 2006 also that are concerned with fraudulent marriages. He has no issues actually bringing her to Quebec. But then Bill 60 happens in 2013, and he says everything changes for him. He suddenly sees, even though Farida is not practicing, she wears a hijab. And this, as he says, makes him a kind of undesirable citizen. As he says, his rose-colored glasses shifted. So he says in this time, actually, it made him very depressed. He briefly left Quebec during the Bill 60 period. And in that same era, when his wife was pregnant with their second son, Farida fainted outside a grocery store. He was with her, called for an ambulance. He recalls being bewildered by the white firefighters' questions. They asked him, how did he meet his wife? Was theirs a forced marriage? Why did she not speak French as well as him? Had he forced her to veil? How had he contributed to her fainting? And as he says, I was in such a state of panic, I just responded to their questions. And he now kind of regrets not calling them out or having a different response. So the first responders' slippage into intimate questions about their sexual lives resonates, I think, with the kind of questioning undertaken by French marriage commissioners. Like in France, secular sexual sensibilities in Quebec ignite pressure on racialized men, particularly those who are imagined either rightly or wrongly as Muslim and as practicing Muslims, to clearly signal to perform their promotion of a secular body through their own habitus. A female partner wearing a hijab made the onus higher for Walid to perform romance, even in a medical emergency. My French, these interlocutors in Quebec, therefore, also, although there aren't the same kind of restrictions in the moment of arrival or as they migrate or immigrate into Quebec, they similarly have these kinds of experiences around the secular body. I'm now going to briefly turn, I know I'm at about minute 35, to this new fieldwork that I'm conducting now in Montreal with a very different group of people. These now are immigrants from France who have migrated to Quebec. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about Justine, 38, who came to Montreal in 2013. She has 2 young children with a French common law spouse. She's an architect. Her parents are of North African origin, and she identifies as an atheist Jew. She explains that her cultural Judaism offers her connections to her parents' history, even though she's an atheist. Interestingly, among many of the women that I've interviewed who are French immigrants in Quebec and in Toronto, public schools are, again, like in France, real sites of thinking about secular sensibilities for these mostly white women. So in her case, she thinks that the secular body in Quebec does not go far enough. She describes the handling of Law 21 it needs to go further with respect to visible religiosity in public schools. So in our interview at a cafe in the Plateau last December, she doesn't see the Quebecois context effectively taking on secularism. And I'm going to just play a quick, so as part of this new project, it's a little kind of side note, we've asked participants if we can use audio clips in our work and in our dissemination, and they have agreed. So I'm going to just briefly play a clip from our interview together, and I've included my translation, but all the interviews, of course, are in French.
Et j'ai l'impression que la loi 21, c'était peut-être plus ça, une façon de protéger l'identité québécoise qui se sentirait un peu menacée par le multiculturalisme. Et donc, imposer une forme de neutralité des institutions, c'est peut-être une façon finalement détournée de protéger l'identité québécoise.
So for Justine, she thinks that the secular, from her perspective, the secular debates in Quebec are really about Quebecois identity and are not going far enough in really showing and protecting a secular body. And she would like to see a more rigorous, adequate, as she calls it, secular body that's more rational and rigidly neutral, especially in her children's school. A second example from Nilan. I'm going to kind of go quickly on this example because I think I received a kindly message from Ellen, just reminding me I have 5 minutes left. So this example is just really capturing Nilan, who's a Black woman of Senegalese origin who comes to Quebec and is now a student in Quebec. She talks about how in the Quebec context, she can wear this head covering. And as she says,
Je ne veux pas m'associer directement à ma religion, je m'associe à ma culture. Oui. Et si je portais un autre voile plus uni, plus genre noir, oui. Là, on va m'associer à ma religion. Oui. Mais là, pour eux, c'est comme culturel, c'est folklorique, c'est comme... c'est son identité africaine qui vaut ça, mais c'est pas son identité religieuse. Alors que pour moi, au final, c'est un peu le même truc. Hein. Je suis pas quelqu'un de voilé,
So she's talking about how in the Quebec context, unlike in France, she can wear a headscarf like this. Because it's kind of seen as like folklorique, it's part of her African heritage, and it passes in the kind of Quebec secular body in a way that doesn't pass in France, but that in both contexts, both in her native Marseille and in Montreal, to wear a Black hijab would go contrary to those secular sensibilities, and she knows would be much more difficult, which is why as a Muslim woman, she chooses to wear this head covering in Montreal. Okay, so now moving on to my conclusion. So I'm going to just return to the question I posed at the beginning of this presentation. What are the imagined secular, what is the imagined secular body that's presented or imagined vis-a-vis the religious bodies that are being disciplined by French and Quebecois secular states? I think that this caricature captures some of the ironies. So here we see Marianne again, who's a symbol of the French Revolution. And we really see here, as captured, like in the pictogram we saw in France, how religiosity is really radically reduced to a kind of sexual excess. Clearly the Muslim and the Catholic priest, who are clearly identified with visible religious signs, are very nervous, can't necessarily handle the secular body here, again captured by Marianne, who's narrowly gendered, again white, and overtly sexualized. And also, right, this woman is mute, which is also a telling symbol in that the secular body is often a female idealized person, but is often mute, which is why I think that the statue of Marianne works so well in capturing this idealized secular body. Okay, other things that I want to talk about is how the kind of imagination of unwanted religious symbols captures this kind of visual cue to idealized secularity that does so much work. Actually, so much is going on in really focusing on undesirable religiosity on symbols and on specific symbols. It's much more easy to manage them, also to dehistoricize them. So in the French case, which obviously there are long histories in France around unveiling women in Algeria as part of its colonial legacy, all of those histories of colonialism, all kinds of history and politics become evacuated when we just see these images only focused on symbols. So we see a real erasure of histories of colonialism. I would say also in the Quebecois context, that religion, Islam is always the kind of problematic religion, but it's portrayed as irrational, coercive, inhibiting free choice, inhibiting individuality. And so religion becomes irrational, coercive, patriarchal, sexually excessive, or deviant in this kind of conceptualization of the idealized secular body, and also to be monitored. Thirdly, that the niqab, I think, is a really rich site, or has been for me, to think about the idealized secular body. The kind of vehemence. Also, there's, all of this legislation that's happened against niqabs. Very few, even when we think about Law 21, the concern has been more on Article 4 than Article 6, that focuses on the niqab. It's kind of forgotten, and also tells us, I think, a lot about the idealized secular body, especially around heteronormativity, around a male gaze, as I tried to argue with certain ideas of romance and patriarchal visions of seduction, kind of are all captured in this critique of niqabs. And lastly, that I think that the visible secular body really establishes very rigid gender roles. So I think this is also important to signal. So it's rendering gender, but in very narrow ways. Also really emphasizing a heteropatriarchal gaze in terms of what is the desirable body. It tends to be very cis-het and very narrow idea of female sexuality. And so in conclusion, I would say that we should be concerned when leaders in France or Quebec, like President Macron or Prime Minister Legault, call for unity and equality in promoting secular laws, not only to determine who is excluded and who or what is privileged in this neutrality, but also because secular bodies and sensibilities remain focused on such an overly narrow gender construct. And I think we should be wary of that. So that's all for me for today. Thank you very much for your attention. You're still with me. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Selby. We're really happy that you could be here with us today and share your fascinating work, and certainly very relevant in the current Quebec context. And so I'll open it up right away to leave some time for questions, discussions. Please share some comments in the chat if you'd like, or raise your hand. We have Ali, I see. Please go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. I was just wondering, I think you really clearly pointed out this idealized secular body and this kind of like cis hetero female body and the male gaze there. I was wondering how something like homo nationalism comes into conversation with this. I'm thinking about during one of the commissions in Quebec. And this is like an anecdote I heard from somebody who studies this. So I actually don't remember the details and I didn't witness it firsthand, but a trans woman was like either put on some sort of stand or in front of media. There was like an audience by those who are proposing the bill. And she was talking about the ways in which she is re-triggered or re-traumatized when she views a woman wearing a niqab or one of the forms of hijab. And so basically this has been talked about, like this kind of weaponizing of one marginalized identity against another, and this kind of idea of homonationalism where kind of the white queer body is assimilated into the ideal secular body to kind of paint like Muslim culture as queer phobic or something. So I'm just wondering how that is that just a tool? Is the ideal secular body still this kind of cis hetero female body, and like the queer body is just being used as a tool? Or yeah, if you could just talk about
Yeah,
that a
no,
bit.
that's a great question. That's a great question. And I've thought about that a little bit. I mean, there's also a lot of evidence of what you're talking about. So I was thinking of when you were talking, I'm just going to share in the chat. You can see this image. So this is an image that came up on the cover of Charlie Hebdo, which is a French satirical magazine that also became very, unfortunately, important because there was a terrorist attack there also in January 2015. Anyway, but here you can see this image of, it's an image of two men kissing, and one of them is depicted as a Muslim man and is clearly kind of uncomfortable by this embrace. And so I do think that there is a way in which the kind of homonational piece becomes really important as kind of further evidence of improper or excessive or deviant sexuality insofar as not being accepting. And we've seen that also in all kinds of other, many scholars have looked at that concern, looking at like citizenship tests in Germany and in the Netherlands that really emphasize mostly monogamous, actually, importantly, but like gay relationships that are monogamous as being part of appropriate sexuality in those contexts. So yes, to answer your question, there's a lot of evidence of that kind of or of that concern of homonationalism also playing out in these contexts. I would say a little bit, I don't know, I haven't charted it as clearly in Quebec. I think that, also in France, you do have these extreme publications like Charlie Hebdo that really push the envelope around free speech and so on. And we don't have those necessarily, maybe as many of those kinds of publications in Quebec. It kind of also goes against maybe Canadian or Quebecois sensibilities to publish those kinds of images. But yeah, I think you're absolutely onto something. And that is part of the depiction of coercive and improper religious sexuality in its homophobia. Thanks for the question.
Yes, Professor Cohn, please go ahead.
So thanks for this really rich and engaging and exciting talk. And you obviously compacted so much into such a short time. I mean, I really have a million questions, but specifically at the end, you sort of focused on how the discourse, it's kind of affirming patriarchy and gender norms. But it sounds like you're also saying that the discourse is creating all kinds of aspects of the normal body, including maybe around race. Is it sort of affirming like a kind of Orientalist construction of race? And I'm also wondering if there's a kind of element of nationalism, since Ali brought that up too, that word, that it's not necessarily dependent on where specifically one is from or gender. And a different question related is to ask about, the Quiet Revolution in Quebec. And I didn't realize that so many Quebecois identify as Catholic. I was actually surprised by that graphic. So yeah, that historical role of that in kind of your analysis of this discourse.
Thank you so much for those questions. I really appreciate that you're here as well. Yeah, so just going back to your point around the centrality of race, I do think it's important. It's interesting now that I've been able to and I haven't really done this analysis yet. It's just kind of burgeoning for me as I'm conducting interviews here in Montreal currently. But definitely when I ask my interlocutors, either who are French white migrants or who are Algerian racialized migrants in Montreal, about how they engage with secular politics or how it impacts them. Interesting how many white French migrants, unless they have like their kids at school or I don't know, for folks who don't have small people that they're taking care of or aren't engaged in hospitals or in other sites where governmentality becomes clearer, most of them will say like, oh yeah, I haven't really thought about that too much, or I thought about it, especially when I met like a Muslim guy, right? Then I really realized. So I think that there is a kind of privilege and banality, obviously, around some of these questions where many folks can just, this the privilege of, as Elaine Oliphant says in her new book, like the privilege of being banal, right? Of like it not impacting you. And so my French migrants who are white certainly have that privilege in ways that Algerians who may or may not be Muslim, but as racialized, some more than others, are impacted by this kind of imaginary. So absolutely race is an important part of the question. And then on the quiet revolution in Quebec, I think that this, in previous work in the French context, I've talked about catholicité, like the ways in which a kind of secularism is permeated in these two contexts anyway, with a kind of Catholic past, at least. And it's interesting, even with the participants that we're asking now, we'll ask them like, they'll say, oh, I'm a devout atheist, and I don't believe in anything related to religion. And then when we ask them about their rituals, they're like, oh yeah, well, I did decide to baptize my kids, like because of social capital, like I wanted to give them that option to go into a Catholic school. Or oh yeah, I forgot, like I do celebrate Saints Day, like my saint, like let's say your name is, I don't know, Jacques, right? There's like an affiliated day in the year where there's a Saint Jacques, and people sometimes celebrate that as like a second birthday, or all of these ways, right? That even I think in the interview process, people become aware. They're like, oh yeah, that's true. I do love galette des rois. Like it's my favorite kind of cake, right? And so I think that there's a kind of way in which, unless if I ask them, do you celebrate Christmas? Many people do, who are atheists, who have kind of Catholic backgrounds, but other kinds of traditions that are really Catholic permeated, people are kind of even embarrassed. Like they're like, oh yeah, I do that. Or oops, like forgot it that I do all these things. So it's not a judgment on my part, but it's interesting. I think that folks are much more imbricated in Catholicism than I think that they realize. So I do see that kind of Catholicness around I don't know if that's what you meant around the Quiet Revolution, like in terms of its continuing importance in people's ritual and spiritual lives in some ways, even if the kind of theological importance of the galette des rois has been evacuated from a gathering with friends to eat a delicious cake, it's still really important to them somehow, that tradition. And whether or not that's related to Catholicism, I guess you could question, but there are resonances there, right? In that it was once, or is for some Catholics, part of their ritual life.
But also a kind of irony, the same way, sort of women are used to affirm patriarchal, control over women or access to women, othering religion is actually a kind of affirming of the power of basically Catholics or former Catholics. I don't know, I see a resonance there in the data you've presented. So really, really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent. Sorry. We have time for one more question, and then we'll take a break right after this. So Carly, if you would like to go.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the different constructs of race operative in France as compared to Quebec, because when I'm thinking of what I've read about France is there's this notion like we're a post-racial society, like égalité, like that we don't do race here. And I see that coming up a lot in the way that gender is being policed, but that's not being acknowledged. And then I think about Quebec, like it operates in a different way. And part of that, I think, is because like Quebecois claims are often take up claims, you know, of like the Black Power movement or like when that's happening, the Quiet Revolution. So it just feels like there's a different history around race, a different conception of race at work here. If you could just comment on that. And also thank you so much for your talk. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much for your question. I think you're right that, and this is where this new project is going. So it's a great question, and that is generative for me to think about my new project that's focusing more on secularism and race. But absolutely, I think that the way that people talk about race is very different in France and in Quebec. For example, in the interviews that we're conducting with French immigrants, we ask them, like, so what is your, how would you self-describe your race or ethnic background? And some of our interlocutors really find that question. And we, like, to be fair, we knew that it was a somewhat taboo question because in France, there's no data collected around race. Race is a very taboo topic, if you will, because it's seen as being divisive. It's seen as kind of engendering multiculturalism or silos or difference, when the goal is really a kind of Republican ideal of sameness that arguably idealizes whiteness, but isn't officially articulated that way. So I definitely see that in how participants, some of whom are researchers and are very articulate around who they are and their identities, are really taken aback by that question or feel very uncomfortable. So might answer, oh, I'm European, or I'm French, or but don't use the word white, for example, or feel very uncomfortable by using that term. So that's kind of anecdotally what we've seen so far with some of our French migrants or immigrants in Quebec. And yet others will say like, oh, it's so interesting how I'm learning more to talk about race in Canada, right? And I don't know if Canadians are that adept at talking about race either. But certainly we also saw in and around the secular debates a desire for the Legault, for the CAQ, for the CAQistes, for François Legault to really say institutional racism does not exist in Quebec. So there is a kind of also just, right, that's not part of our history, that the colonial past is not part of the present necessarily. And so there are other ways in Quebec that I think those ideas operate, and arguably in the rest of Canada as well.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, everybody, for that discussion. I wish we could go on for longer. I myself have like 5 questions written down, but Jennifer, I'll just email them to you later, I guess.
Yes, yeah, I would love that. I'm in Montreal, so
yeah,
I'm disembodied here on your screen. I am in town, so
that's right. We can all discuss all this later in person. But right now we're going to take a quick break, so we'll reconvene here at 2:15 for our panel. So thank you again, Jennifer.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.
All right, see you everybody at 2:15.
So welcome back. Welcome to those who have just joined us for this panel entitled Ritual Matters, Embodied Practices and Their Effects. So we're looking forward to hearing from 4 presenters today, and the panel will be moderated by Ali Smears. So Ali is a PhD student in the Department of Religions and Cultures at Concordia. Her academic background is in South Asian religions and gender studies. She's currently working on her doctoral thesis, examining specific contemporary South Asian artwork that centers the body as a site of contestation over ideas of nation and tradition. So, very exciting work. And I will pass it on to Ali. Thank you all for being here. Enjoy.
Thank you, Katrina. Everyone can hear me? All right, great. And thanks for everyone for sticking around for this panel. We will just jump right in. We're going to go through all 4 presentations and then save the question period for at the end. So if anyone, again, has questions throughout, you can save it or you can type it into the chat and we'll collect them here for the question period. So Ritual Matters, Embodied Practices and Their Effects. Our first presenter is David Reed Hall, graduating from the University of Pittsburgh in 2022 with bachelor's degrees in religious studies and microbiology. David Reed Hall's primary research focus is the intersection between disease, death, and the history of religion in the United States. He has previously worked on projects covering how 19th century US Protestant publications contextualized cholera epidemics within a religious framework, the Church of England's official response to the COVID-19 pandemic, how cholera and COVID-19 were used to justify xenophobia, and how religious symbols characterize different kinds of sacred space in the rural cemetery movement. So each of these projects were done to better understand how religious traditions understand suffering, disease, and death alongside the wider cultural implications that they might have. He's also worked on local religious history in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, with special interest in the historic Protestant revivals hosted by John Wilbur Chapman and Billy Sunday. David comes to us with a presentation titled Revival Performed, Internal Dynamics of Protestant Religious Revivals, 1870 to 1930. So welcome, David.
Thank you so much for the amazing opportunity to present. And it's that project dealing with local religious history that ended up spawning this presentation. And let me make sure everything's good. Can everyone see my screen all right? Perfect. So it was in January 29th, 1877, in the Park Street Congregational Church in Boston. It was filled to the brim by onlookers. People from Boston had come to see a spectacle, a true, genuine revival, where they believed that God would be at work to reconsecrate the faithful and convert the faithless. They were not just there for eloquent oration either, for the uneducated speaker was described by Reverend G.R. Levitt as having bad grammar that had only worsened over time. This performer of religion was not packing the pews with his intellectual prowess, but rather his ability to display and evoke an emotional response from his audience. As Reverend Levitt goes on to describe, the same light is in his face, the same flashes of wit brighten his homely speech. There is the same occasional tenderness touching on the fountain of tears. There is the same imperial force of will. The power of God is upon him as it was not in its fullest then. The revivalists could propagate what they believed were genuine spiritual experiences in their audience. This was not just any local revival either. It was one held by the celebrity revivalist Dwight Lyman Moody. Moody was a lay preacher who gained his fame conducting a series of revivals in England starting in 1873 and returned to the United States in 1875 to conduct a new campaign to bring in converts and awaken the Protestant laity. His services ended up setting the tone for many other revivalists in the Anglosphere, especially John Wilbur Chapman, Reuben Archer Torrey, and Billy Sunday. During one of Moody's revivals, the audience would hear scripture readings and listen to multiple speakers' testimonies of faith, sing hymns led by Moody's associate Ira Sankey, and actively participate in prayer, culminating in a communal performance of faith. As Robert Orsi has acutely described, religion arises at the intersection of inner experience and the outer world. These revivals ultimately are methods to translate that inner experience of the revivalist to the outer world through social performance of faith. This active dynamic between the audience and revivalist is how the revivalists perform their faith has rarely been highlighted in the law of scholarship on this period and will now be given its due attention. Starting in 1875 and coming to an end with the close of the 1920s, Americans flocked to these so-called revivals. It was popular among evangelical Protestants, though many of these revivals on the local level cut through denominational lines. The leaders of this movement tended to be a mix of regular Protestant clergy and also laity, who claimed religious authority through personal experience and an experience that they then marketed and acted out for their audiences in order to socially model religious behaviors to the public. Preachers like Dwight Moody, Billy Sunday, Amy Semple McPherson, and many others traveled around the United States or even internationally to spread the message of conversion and authentic religion. Through a careful alliance with emerging mass media like newspapers and radio, several revivalists achieved celebrity status in a platform where they could amplify their own performances. For example, Moody revolutionized his influence through a close partnership with newspaper reporters, which aided it with his credibility with the US white middle class. He chose or constructed venues that allowed for large audiences to come from throughout the city. His Boston Tabernacle in 1877 had 8 grand entrances and a seating capacity of 6,000 and a platform that could hold 800 in addition to a 2,000-member choir. While popular in their time, changing currents in American consumer and entertainment culture in the 1920s and 30s led to a steady decline of this big tent revivalism, as their novelty and main social message had become dated. It would not be until the post-war period in the 1950s where Billy Graham would host such services on the same scale. Unfortunately, scholarly analysis of this revivals in the late 19th and early 20th century has been mostly limited to examinations of their theology and evangelistic work, with luckily a few works analyzing performance of gender on behalf of figures like Dwight Moody and Amy Semple McPherson. Consequently, reducing these public displays down to key speeches misses the element of spectacle and audience dynamic of these events. From singing hymns, calls for the audience engagement in prayer and repentance, and citywide coordination and outreach that goes into a revival, there are numerous actions on behalf of both the revivalist and audience that goes into the idea that they were more than just passive consumers. By recognizing these highly social acts on behalf of both the audience and revivalist as a form of performing religious experience, it opens up inquiry into the religious dynamics being modeled by the revivalists and the response it elicits in the audience. During the period following the end of the Civil War, the United States was going through a period of dramatic change. US cities swelled under rapid urbanization and increasing immigration, and this was coupled with an explosion of industry that transformed the national economy. Under these influences, which brought about social change due to rising consumer culture, urban Protestants felt increasingly disconnected from traditional patterns of social life. In the midst of this transformation, revival claimed to offer and ground them in authentic religious experience. These revivalists believed this genuine religion could only be achieved through a conversion experience, described by Dwight Moody's sermon on being born again in 1877, and even William James's varieties of religious experience. In his sermon, Moody clearly laid out that the goal of his revivalistic work was centered on the transformative experience of being born again, saying, "All is changed. That is the conversion we are aiming at. God regenerates them, recreates them in his own image." He has trouble describing what exactly this regeneration is and what forms it takes, and explains it's not easy to put into words, which tends to be the nature of most internal religious experiences. Though Moody is unable to describe the nature of this event to his audience, he affirms his own personal experience with it, saying, "I feel a different man than I did 21 years ago last March when God gave me a new heart." This personal experience is where he gains the authority to preach on the subject of conversion and then models that externally through the effects of that on stage to his audience for them to emulate. He gives his entire body of revival and evangelistic work as a tangible example of how his life was changed by this experience. Importantly, he and other revivalists argue this experience cannot be found in traditional forms of Protestant practices like going to church or even reading the Bible. They separate out these external practices from internal, genuine religious experience and feeling, and that authentic external practice must proceed from that internal change of heart. This appeal to genuine religion proved to be culturally resonant among US Protestants, which enhanced the emotional appeal of the audience, which is described in many newspaper accounts of the time. By rejecting traditional forms of religion and then performing his faith on stage for hundreds of or even thousands of audience members, Moody mediated cultural experience of internal religious revival through his external displays of how it has changed his life. After his death in 1899, new revivalists would build upon his techniques, one such being the former baseball player Billy Sunday, who reached the height of his popularity in the 1910s. He claimed to have been converted following a meeting of urban missionaries. Following that, he started preaching with Moody's pupil, John Wilbur Chapman. Sunday's critical innovation was the incorporation of emerging corporate structures into his revivals organizations, which improved his outreach and efficiency in drawing crowds. His revivals were often in wooden structures that were purpose-built by local Protestants ahead of his revival in the city. These structures, called tabernacles, could accommodate large crowds and provide an environment for many personal workers to move through and encourage the audience as part of the revival. This encouragement involved calls to hit the sawdust trail, a term asking them to go to the front of the tabernacle, where others would be waiting to guide them through this personal conversion. It was called the sawdust trail due to the sawdust they used in the aisles to muffle the sound of footsteps, which allowed the audience to focus instead on the revivalist and the music and the people around them. For the performance itself, Sunday adopted a homely style of speaking, similar to Moody, but would supplement it with greatly exaggerated movements, as shown on the right. During his sermons, he was known to act out stories from biblical characters and his own personal experience and his continuing message for his audience. As Robert Fuller has previously described, revivalists were skilled at evoking emotional pathways that end in feelings of euphoria and relief, and Sunday is no different. Through his displays and embodying his message, he could further emphasize that emotional aspect in order to enhance the audience response by creating a larger spectacle. This both distanced himself from traditional preaching and encouraged the audience to follow his lead in his actions. The spectacle created then spawned many criticisms, leading to caricatures of how he preached, being widely circulated in many magazines around the country. Although critiqued, Sunday made visual and internal religious experience for his audience to then interpret. His unique style of preaching kept audiences captivated while continuing to culturally mediate a performed ritual of conversion. While he did eventually try to perform over radio and later had a sermon filmed, these attempts came after the peak of his popularity and did not end up having much of an impact on his overall style of performance. Amy Semple McPherson, on the other hand, was quite different from Sunday or Moody. Her popularity peaked following her transition away from being an itinerant preacher and towards her permanent church in Los Angeles. She was heavily influenced by her Pentecostal background, a religious movement that in turn began in the Azusa Street revivals in 1906. McPherson recounts how she had been converted following her attendance at a revival led by her future husband, Robert Semple. Following that, she transformed her life around, claims to have transformed her life around Christ. McPherson shared previous revivalists' innovative spirit with media by expanding her services over the radio and broadcasting them around the country starting in 1924. Although her image was not broadcasted, she took special attention to perform her femininity for her audience through visual means, such as her iconic costume consisting of a white maid's outfit and a black cape. Her reasoning for that fashion choice was that it would better exemplify her submission and service to God following her personal conversion. This consequently makes her a model of a new kind of Christian woman in the early 20th century. This modern Christian woman is one that would use her newfound freedom following women's suffrage in 1920 to take an active role in the church and religion following a genuine conversion experience that McPherson claimed to provide. Although McPherson, Sunday, and Moody all reached massive audiences, some doubted about how many new members they actually brought to local churches. Despite the revivals attracting thousands with promises of genuine religion, very few local churches gained sizable, significant numbers of members. This was primarily due to the fact that most attendants were already churchgoers. This was not isolated to historical revivals either. Billy Graham's in the revivals in the 1950s also were found to be mostly made up of regular churchgoers. So rather than evangelistic missions, these performances should better be understood as rites of reaffirmation, where Protestants could go to reaffirm their faith in a ritual that is led and modeled by a celebrity revivalist embodying an internal conversion experience. Although much of the audience may have been in attendance to reaffirm their faith, these revivalists also sought to transform the cultural norms through bounded religious performance. Moody and Sunday were great critics of American society and the state of religion at the time in their sermons, and critiqued the state of late Victorian US life. In drawing special attention to social transformation, revivals act as a transition between cultural ways of life, which is catalyzed on the personal level through the propagation of internal conversion experiences. These revivalists embodied the conversion experience and sought to transmit that via performance to their audience in order to transform the world based off a Protestant ethic. Importantly, these audience members were also subject to social bounds in how they responded. This is clearly seen in the many accounts of individuals attending a revival claiming to have had religious experiences or revelations of their own and being labeled as insane or religious cranks, as one newspaper put it. Thus, a revival is a delicate performance, balancing cultural norms of what a genuine religious experience is and the transformation that the revivalists and audience were trying to achieve. As Moody's 1877 service back in Boston concluded, Reverend Levitt described how the vast assembly was called to rise in reconsecration, and, led by Mr. Sankey, breathed out at his request, very, very softly, as a personal prayer. This moment impacted Levitt so much that he believed that the objections of the most doubtful would have yielded. This intimate rite of reconsecration under the name revival that performers marketed as genuine religious experience, and it was one that they did not believe could come from traditional religious establishments. Through the lens of performance, the dynamic between the audience member and revivalist can be fully appreciated in modeling and responding to the narrative conversion experience. These revivalists offered novelty, organization, ecumenism, and a more heavily experiential side of religion to their audience through performing their faith on stage. All three of the revivalists discussed today fall outside the traditional bounds of clergy by not having undergone formal seminary training, and in McPherson's case, being a woman preacher in the 1920s. Despite that, they were able to amass large crowds through mass media techniques and marketing their own personal religious experience. Through equal parts demonstration and persuasion, the preacher would do the work of revival by embodying their message so that the audience can then emulate and respond to it. Their audience was brought to this event seeking an authentic experience, a way to reaffirm their faith, and a novel religious service outside the bounds of everyday US Protestantism. As active participants in the work of revival, the audience would then respond internally through the encouragement of personal workers and revivalists, and externalize that through shouts during the service, affirmations, prayers, and signing inquiry cards at the end so that they may be contacted by churches. Ultimately, the performance within the revival of the late 19th and early 20th centuries centered on this interplay between the revivalist and the audience, who both projected and personified a renewed Protestant ethic. Beyond acting as a model for how religious revivals operated on an internal and external level, it gives us insight to how US Protestants pursued an authentic lived religion by performing their faith. This drive for authentic experience captivated Americans in the face of mass urbanization and rising consumerism, and is still relevant today. This leads us to the present reports of revival at Asbury University, which started on February 8th of this year. What went on at Asbury is quite different than the revivals of the late 19th and 20th century, but many of the similar underlying dynamics remain the same. Asbury is rooted in a Methodist holiness theology, which emphasizes continual revival, and often lacks a central guiding figure for which the audience can use as a model. But there is still that seeking of authentic experience. The audience search for genuine religious experience drew people from around the country to Asbury, and once there, individuals continually performed their faith for their peers, taking turns preaching, praying, and singing. In this new revival, the audience is key and can be seen as a collective performance for themselves and their peers to reaffirm their faith. The same promise of genuine religious experience is acted out on stage as part of a performed understanding of conversion, and is continuing to influence religious life in the modern world. Ultimately, all of these Protestant revivals contain elements of performed faith as validation for its authenticity and transmission of ideas around proper religious experience that continue to shape their understanding of faith and conversion. Thank you for listening, and again, I really appreciate the opportunity to present.
Great. Thank you so much, David. Fascinating presentation. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to maybe talking a bit more about these animated bodily performances in more detail in the question period. We'll move to our next presenter, Rodrigo D'Alcantara. So Rodrigo is a Brazilian multi-artist and researcher, currently a PhD student in art history at Concordia University. He holds a master's in visual arts from Universidade Federal de Rio de Janeiro and a bachelor in fine arts from Universidade de Brasilia. His artistic and theoretical practices feed Brazilian mythologies and allegories from a dissident, syncretic, and multidimensional perspective. His practice has been exhibited in institutions such as Agentil Carioca, Mendes Woodiem, Museo Ettore Fico Turin, Trans Film Festival Berlin, Aphrodite Athens Epidaurus, Balongo International Festival, Les Mangouches International Festivals Universitaires, Vancouver Latin American Film Festival, and others. He was awarded with grants like the Culture and Citizenship Award LGBTI Culture 2018, Transcreation from UQAM 2021, and the Elspeth McConnell Fine Arts Award from Concordia in 2022. And he's published in several academic journals such as RACAR, Revista Consinitas, Arte y Ensayos, and the Center for Sensory Studies. Rodrigo is here with a presentation titled Asojabas and the Tupi Ritualistic Legacy, a Trans-Ancestral Approach. Welcome, Rodrigo, and I apologize for any of my pronunciation there.
No problem. Thank you so much for the introductions, and thank you for the opportunity to be here sharing my current research. I would just start sharing my screen. Okay. Can everybody see it? Yeah. Okay. So the first thing that I would like to acknowledge, this presentation will be more, I love to manifest my knowledge in a more fluid way. So I will just talk in consonance with the images that I brought. I really like to share this idea of visual knowledge. So I brought this map from the early modern period of Brazil, in which we can see the coastal indigenous nations that inhabited these territories. The very term Tupinambá or Tupi was a term used for the European colonizers to homogenize these indigenous nations that were located in the coast. So this is really important to acknowledge that, like, when I refer to the Tupinambá people as Tupi, I am also perpetuating this concept that was not created by them themselves. Like, it was not a term that they used back then prior to the colonial project. A term that a lot of these Tupi nations used was Pindorama to name these territories of the coast of Brazil. And nowadays I am one of the scholars that are also taking an active voice to use the term Abiyala, which is a term coming from the Kuna people from Panama and Colombia nowadays, to refer to the whole Americas. So I will refer to Americas as Abiyala throughout my presentation today. And so before the colonial project, a lot of scholars say that the population of the Tupinambá people was around 2 million, more or less. And they were, their societies were consisted of ceremonial traditions that involved dance, sound, movement, and adornment. And here on the left, we can see some depictions of the type of architecture that they used to have, usually with wood and really organized shelves. They also used to have internal trade markets. So like the Tupinamba people became really known in the early modern era in Europe by their anthropophagic rituals, which can be translated as cannibalistic, but also it's not the same. So like anthropophagic rituals were more about understanding the life-death spectrums related to war. And they were having internal wars between different indigenous nations in this period as well. And as a result of these wars, they would make some enemies captives. And as a sign of respect to the enemies, they would make their enemies part of their societies and then kill them and then eat their flesh. And this is kind of like a controversial idea of the Tupinamba people, because a lot of scholars also contest these primary sources that were done only by the colonial gaze of the European missionaries that were going and the mercenaries that were exploring these lands and enslaving the indigenous peoples as well. So nowadays we have this two perspectives. There are some inconsistencies in some of these depictions of the early modern era. We can notice that a lot of the indigenous peoples are depicted with Caucasian features instead of indigenous features. And even some of these artists, they never left Europe, which is the case of Théodore de Brie, here on the right. This is one of the most famous depictions of these rituals. So basically what we argue nowadays is that a lot of these artistic depictions coming from the European missionaries, they were meant to perpetuate a stereotype of the idea of the savage and also homogenize all indigenous nations of Abya Yala as wild societies, barbarians, and so we are not like 100% sure how these rituals took place. But one main figure of these rituals were the asojabas, or the Tupinamba mantles, which are these really stunning pieces of featherwork practice done by featherwork masters from the Tupinamba nations. And they were mainly produced between the 1500s and the 1700s. Nowadays, we have 11 of these mantles in European collections, and some of them can't even be displayed in public exhibitions anymore because they are really fragile. And this is also due to the conditions, the weather conditions in Abya Yala, right? Like especially in Brazil, in the tropics, that they don't preserve this type of feathers, and also they were not meant to be preserved. So in a lot of indigenous nations and indigenous cosmovisions, there is this notion of artifacts having agency and having, like, they are embedded with soul, so that they are also animistic. And they are part of their understanding of community and of material culture. And I really would like to stress in the structure of the asojaba itself, there is this idea of having two parts. So there's this bonnet, like there's this hat, and there's the mantle. And the bonnet is done with young birds' feathers, while the mantle is done with adult birds. And during the rituals, they believed there was a transfiguration of their own body, that they could like channel a mediumistic way to enable the entities that were part of their cosmovisions to come to life, and they would be transfigured into a bird themselves. So the shamans and the people involved in the rituals wearing the asojabas, they would become birds in their own cosmovisions and beliefs. And they were always related to life-death ceremonies. So like funeral ceremonies or these rituals done after wars and after massive deaths. So it's really also important to acknowledge that Renaissance and the idea of imperialism is connected to the idea of colonization. They are a mutually dependent phenomena, as the Salvadorian scholar Conce Cornejo also used this term to connect globalization, modernity, and colonialism as a single spectrum. And these pieces of featherwork, they were also homogenized in European artistic practice of the time. One example is the royal entries or the joyas and clés. And this type of carnivalesque performance would be performed by some indigenous people that were kept captive by the Europeans and brought to Europe to perform their own cultures or other indigenous cultures alongside Europeans. And this is an example coming from Holland. So for those who don't know, like actually Brazil was also colonized by the Dutch. We had like a colony in the northeast of Brazil called New Holland. So this refers to this moment of time that the Dutch were colonizing Brazil and bringing these artifacts to Europe. So their royal entries were kind of like vulgarizing the sacred aspect of these pieces. And as we can see, there are many pieces that were not made by the Tupinamba people. Like these standards and these shields were part of the Aztec culture or the Nahua Mexica culture. And they were put it all together again to frame this idea of otherness, alterity, and performative ethnics. And this is another example of how the asojabas were absorbed by the European nobles and how the European nobles knew the power of this featherwork pieces. They were only worn by people that were related to the court, the Dutch court in this case, to the Maurice de Nassau. And I don't have time to talk about all the details that I would like to share with you, but these are the new asojabas. So like in 2006, the new attempts of reconnecting the Tupinamba people that are still resisting in Brazil to their ancestors became a reality. So this revival of the practice of featherwork in the Tupinamba people came from Glyceria Tupinamba. Glyceria Tupinamba is one of the main leaders of the current Tupinamba people. They were claimed as extinct for a long time in the official Brazilian narratives, and then only in the 2000s they claimed their ancestors, and they were finally heard and made official again. And there is a really intriguing sensorial network and immaterial network that manifests this Tupinamba mentals. So Glyceria Tupinamba was able to travel to Paris in 2006, and she could sense one of her ancestors, one of these asojabas in Parisian collection, and she was able to identify the type of technique that was done in one of these asojabas, and she realized that it was really close to the techniques that they still use in a lot of indigenous nations, not only the Tupinambá, to do the fishing nets, which is called gerere. Is gerere stitch is the name of the technique. So she was able to reenact this practice and to reconnect with her ancestors, also in a spiritual level, because they believe that the asojabas are connected to the encantados, or the enchanted ones, which are these entities that still inhabit the spiritual world, and they had never ceased to exist in the spiritual level. So also it's really important to understand how for many indigenous nations and in their cosmovisions, the dream world is related to everyday life, and these entities can talk with them and make possible this type of manifestation in the material world as well. So there is a really complex network that is related to the reestablishment of this practice, because they also reestablish an ecological, ancestral, and social cultural balance for the contemporary Tupinambá culture. And they also have this trans-ancestral aspect, because they are being remanifested not only by the Tupinambá people, but also by other indigenous nations of Brazil, which is the case of the Tucano. And this asojaba was done by Dayara Tucano, which is from the Tucano nation. And it's also like a way to reassort this dynamics between indigenous objects, artifacts, and the museum audience. So this artwork called Kati Yohon, or Mirror of Life, has this mirror, and it can also be a performance or an installation. It can just stand there in a mannequin and reflect back the colonial gaze of the audience. Is this idea of returning these layers of historicity back to the audience and acknowledging this ancestral presence. So the remanifestation of the asojabas in contemporary Brazilian art is a way to reinforce political imagination and reassert social justice for indigenous material culture and environmental inquiries as well, as we could see. I don't have any more time, but thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Rodrigo. Wow, this was fascinating artistic tradition. I think already from our first two presentations, we're getting like these really two very distinct examples of ways bodies are conceived in relation to environment in really different ways. Looking forward to talking about that. Our next presenter is Mariangela Carpinteri, who's a PhD student in religion studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She is specialized in Japanese religions and their relationship with the natural environment. Her current research is about a Shinto purification ritual called ohare, in which various natural elements, air, mountains, trees, and water, play the role of ritual tools through which spiritual purification is accomplished. Her recent research also involves some Confucian philosophers, especially Kumazawa Banzen, Ninomiya Sontoku, and Miura Bayan of the Edo period, their perception of nature and how nature is related to the concrete solutions they provide for the most urgent social problems of their era. Her past research was focused on the development of green Buddhism, a Western form of Buddhism in which some Buddhist teachings are combined with environmental ideas. Mariangela has a presentation, titled,
go on.
Titled A Purification Ritual, the Case of ohare, and again, I'll let you correct.
Oharae, but it's almost good. Thank you very much. Can you hear me well? Okay, thank you. thank you very much for your invitation and for organizing this webinar. I'm sharing my screen as well. My presentation actually has something to do with Rodrigo's presentation. So it's a pleasure for me to introduce you to this ritual of the Shinto tradition. So we are in Japan, and it's a purification ritual that is called O-Harai. Literally, it means great purification. The first forms of this ritual it was actually established at the end of the 7th century, but the first form of the ritual probably began before the 7th century. It's just that we don't have much documentation, so it's difficult to define, but the official establishment was at the end of the 7th century. It is important to highlight that originally this was an esoteric ritual. It was a court ritual, closed, and it was performed only by the emperor, very few high aristocrats, and the Shinto priest. Nowadays, it's a popular ritual. What I mean is that it's open to the public, and it's actually a social event performed twice a year, at the end of June and at the end of December. There are many perspectives through which this ritual can be studied. What I will focus today is on and my focus will be on the elements that are used in the ritual, that are also elements coming from the natural environment, and also the various phases of the ritual, what actually happens during this ritual. In general, there will be a formula. There is a formula that is chanted, and in this formula that I will present more details later, in this formula, there is the description of how the pollution is, and I will explain what I mean by pollution in a moment, how the pollution is collected from the peak of the mountains and then is carried through the river toward, sorry, I'm presenting, okay. So it's carried through the river, and then eventually it's disposed in the ocean depth. So this movement from the highest levels to the deepest areas recreates a mythological expulsion, an expulsion that is told in a myth, the myth of the god Susanoo. So I don't have the time, of course, to say the whole myth, but I can say that Susanoo is a very popular god of the Shinto tradition, and he's also a problematic god. In the myth, he is entrusted with the realm of the seas, but for some reasons he does not like it, and he keeps on complaining and lamenting until his father Izanagi expels him from the heavens, where these gods dwell, to the depth of the ocean. So this movement is reproposed in the O-Harai. It's actually a combination of two smaller rituals. One is the smaller harai, and the other one is the misogi. This is more how a harai looks like, more or less. I'm sorry for the quality of the picture. The harai is a shorter ritual that is performed on a daily basis. So, for example, when you buy a new car or a new house, you call the Shinto priest to have it purified. Or also when there is some problem that you feel that there is some problem in your apartment, some evil spirit that lingers around, you call the Shinto priest to have it purified. In fact, harai means purification, expulsion, but also exorcism. The other ritual is the misogi, that you probably have an idea about already, because the image of a guy under a waterfall is pretty popular. So that is a form of meditation, but that is also a form of purification. It's an example of a misogi. The misogi always implies the water. So there is always the use of water, usually the water of rivers, and it can be performed with a deep or partial immersion. So the combination of these two rituals create the O-Harai. I've been talking about purification and pollution, but what does it mean in the context of the O-Harai? Pollution is not material, at least as far as I know. I'm still researching on it, but as in general, pollution in the O-Harai is spiritual. There are two terms to define it. One is tsumi, that can be translated as sins, crimes, or violation of taboos. The tsumi implies the presence of an agent that voluntarily or involuntarily, without even knowing it, commits a crime or violates a taboo. On the other hand, we have kegare, which are events that just happens and the subjects have to endure them, have to experience them. So for example, natural disasters, death, accidental fire, pandemics, as we already know about, and menstrual blood is a very popular form of pollution because it has been treated, as you can imagine, in the recent academic literature pretty often. Sometimes when you violate a taboo, you can enrage a god, and the god can in turn, or a god or a spirit, and the god can in turn cause a disease. So sometimes kegara and tsumi get intermingled together. But what does it happen during a hoharai? So first of all, chinowa is set up. The chinowa is a grass ring. It's set up some days before the ritual, and what happens is that the participants cross the chinowa. This is called chinowa kuguri, which means literally crossing the chinowa. The grass ring is mentioned for the first time in a myth. And what is important about this myth is that it's associated the chinowa with not only with good luck, but more specifically with good health. So you want to cross the chinowa to wish good luck for yourself, but more specifically good health, and also for your family and for your dearest ones. This is another beautiful picture of a chinowa. Usually, not usually, actually always, the chinowa are set up at the entrance of the ritual area. So they are often under the Shinto door that is called tori. So beyond the chinowa, there is the ritual area and also the sacred area. Usually they are circumferences, but you can also find other shapes like the squash shape, for example. It depends on the shrine. Everybody is welcome to cross the chinowa, including pets. Actually, pets are a popular addition in the last decades to the ritual, and some shrines build special, smaller chinowa next to the big one, specifically for the passage of the pets, like, for example, dogs, cats, rabbits, and sometimes also some kind of bird, so that also the pets get their purification, their good wish for good health. And also vehicles. So this is not very common, but there are definitely some shrines that build this massive, gigantic chinowa. This is a shrine in Kyoto, specifically for the passage of vehicles, cars, motorcycles, but also vans and buses. The reason for this is that many participants in the oharai are commuters. They drive every day, and they are specifically worried about car crashes. So passing the chinowa with your car means wishing good luck that you're not going to have a car crash, at least in the next 6 months. That is the span of time, the span of time that is covered by one oharai. And yeah, this is another picture with historical vehicles. The chinowa is made of a specific type of grass called kogon grass. It has these long, sharp leaves that are believed to keep away evil spirits. And it's also an ingredient of the Chinese medicine used for diuretic purposes and for its hemostatic properties. There are chinowa like this that have their grass not woven on purpose to enhance the positive influence, influence of the chinowa. So when you cross the chinowa, you go and sit in one of the chairs. There are usually chairs prepared in front of the kamidana, that is the Shinto altar, where a Shinto priest will chant a series of formula. And the most important is the Nakatomi no Harai, is the formula that is specifically the formula chanted during the oharai. This formula describes the movement I talked about a little bit earlier of the pollution from the peak of the mountains to the depth of the ocean. This movement is possible through four gods, four deities. The first one, and these four deities are described in the formula. The first one is Seoritsuhime. She's a goddess of the mountains. She dwells in the mountains, more specifically in the rivers, in the rapids of the rivers. This is not a coincidence. The water that is used in a Shinto ritual is a running water. So the water that is considered purifying is running water, and only running water. So only rivers and the ocean are used during a Shinto ritual. For example, lakes, hot springs, or for example, wells are considered stagnant water, so they are not usually used. Anyway, Seoritsuhime starts collecting pollution from the peak of the mountains and then carries this pollution through the river until the I would say the entrance of the ocean, where there is another deity, Haya Akitsuhime, that the word kami that you see in the slide means deity. Haya Akitsuhime basically takes this pollution and brings it to the superficial level, in the superficial level of the ocean, where there is the third god, Ibukidonushi, that sometimes is a god, sometimes she's a goddess. It depends on the interpretation, and the formula is not very clear about that. But what is interesting for us here is that he's a god described as a wind, and more specifically a wind of the acts inside the water. So some scholars of the pre-modern period in Japan have speculated that the formula is describing vortices, marine vortices that swallow the pollution toward the abyss. And in the abyss, there is the last goddess, Haya Sasurahime, that turns this pollution into something harmless, into something good. We don't know exactly how, because again, the formula does not give the details of that, does not provide the details, but that's what she does. And this is a cute drawing that summarizes the four phases and the four deities. There are other elements that are relevant, that are used in the Oharai. One of them is the Onusa, that is a wand used by the Shinto priest. Basically, the priest shakes the onusa in the air and toward the participant to collect the pollution from the participant and from the environment around. It's made of this long rice paper stripes. The rice paper is considered to be able to absorb pollution also on a material level, so that it absorbs liquids, for example, and also dirt. And of course, in the Oharai, more specifically, it absorbs the spiritual pollution. It's also made of this long stick that is wood coming from a sacred tree called sakaki. The Latin name is Clareia japonica, if I'm not wrong. This is a tree that you find pretty often around the Shinto shrines and the Buddhist temples also. It's considered sacred for a number of reasons, but probably the most relevant one is that it's believed to be located in the border between the realm of the gods and the realm of the human beings. And so it's believed to be a bridge between these two realms. There is one last element that I want to highlight that is very popular and immediately associated with the Oharai is the hitogata. It's a doll, a paper doll that, as you can see, has the shape of the subject that is treated cars, human beings, or animals. And what you do with the hitogata, it's made of rice paper, also this one. What you do with the hitogata is that you rub it on the part of your body that is in pain or that has some problem that has to be treated. And then you blow on it to transfer the pollution of the whole of your body into the hitogata. Eventually, both the hitogata and the onusa, the wand, are thrown away into the river. Because it's that moment in which Seoritsuhime, the first deity, is passing by and is carrying away all the pollution. For many reasons, specifically for ecological reasons, but also when a shrine does not have a river nearby, it's not actually possible to use a river. So what they do in that case is setting up a fire, and the goma, the purifying fire, the sacred fire. And this fire is a special fire because it's prepared on purpose for that ritual. It's a type of fire that you see in other types of rituals as well. So it's specifically prepared for the purification ritual, and then it's extinguished right after. It cannot be used for anything else, and it cannot come in touch with any of the elements that are outside the ritual area, because it can get polluted very easily. And yeah, so these are oh yeah, well, the one last thing about the goma is that it's not a Shinto thing. Actually, it comes from the Buddhist tradition, so it's a Buddhist influence. And if we go even earlier than that, it comes from the Shinto schools. On a final note, I just want to highlight the fact that in the recent years, in the past recent decades, actually, the Oharaya has been used by people to address their personal problems, to have a good wish, a good luck wish for their personal problems, but also to think about the problems of the world. And some shrines have dedicated a specific Oharae for a specific problem. So for example, in the past Oharae of June 2022, this is a Oharae in Osaka, of a shrine in Osaka. This celebration has been dedicated to the war in Ukraine, more specifically as a wish to end the conflict as soon as possible. And Ukrainian students that were studying in Japan have been welcomed to participate. In the past years, as you can imagine, it has been that the various Oharae in the shrines have been dedicated to the COVID, so to the end of the pandemics, and to the climate change also. It's a very recurrent topic. And so again, it's becoming a kind of social comfort. I believe this is a good expression. It's becoming a kind of social comfort for people to think about or to address their personal problems, but also the problems of the contemporary era. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I've been interrupted. There were people coming.
Oh, no worries with
my...
that. That's okay.
Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for this presentation. I'm myself am very interested in kind of thinking about pollution and the ontological nature of pollution, and kind of its relationship to the body of the individual, but also the social body or the body of the environment. I see definite links between your presentation and Rodrigo's before as well. All right, we will move to our final presentation. This is a presentation by Yuhan Long, who is a PhD candidate in Japanese studies at Durham University. She received her MA degree in comparative literature at Beijing Normal University. Her current project mainly focuses on how Japanese Zen, in the form of embodied knowledge, has been transmitted cross-culturally since the early 20th century. And this presentation is titled Thinking Through the Body, Embodied Zen in the Art of Japanese Archery. Welcome, Yuhan.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you very much for having me and giving me the chance to present. And I feel like I learned a lot. And so I'm going to share my screen. Let me start right now by first introduce the figure that I want to talk about, named Yugen Harigo. Yes, Yugen Harigo lectured about his experience of learning Japanese archery, that is Kyujutsu Kyudo under Awa Kenzo, during his stay in Japan from May 1924 to July 1929 at Berlin branch of the Germany-Japan Association in 1936. The manuscript of the lecture was soon published under the title of Chivalrous Art of Archery and laid out the primary structure of Zen in the Art of Archery, which was published later in 1948. This tiny book, whereby Herogel rose to fame, was widely read among the Western public, for it actualized the ineffable Zen as a tangible experience of learning the art of archery. It was also introduced back to Japan as evidence of the worldwide popularity of Japanese cultures in correspondence to the prosperous discussion of Japaneseness, which is the national character of Japan from the 1960s to 1970s. My paper is basically on literature base, so I'm gonna show you some of the versions of the book Zen in the Art of Archery. Notably, the English Zen in the Art of Archery was translated into English in 1953, and it was given a foreword by D.T. Suzuki, Zen writers, which was very popular in European countries as well as America during the 1950s and 60s. And I'm going to come back later on these figures. And martial arts, physical exercise, though, have been frequently interpreted and enchanted as a form of spiritual practice. The art of archery is no exception. Its association with Zen Buddhism, in particular, the principle of no-mindedness, further consolidates this tendency. Understanding Zen as an Eastern form of mysticism, Herogel also defined archery training as spiritual cultivation rather than purely a physical exercise, and the technical aspect was by no means the main subject of his writings. For instance, despite that he clearly delineated the three major stages of his archery training, that is, drawing the bow, loosing the arrow, and shooting the target, Herogel did not even mention the important A procedures of shooting, Hasitsu, as you can see on the screen, the fundamental techniques commonly used in most branches of archery performance in Japan. The role of the body and the way it interplays with the mental aspect in the so-called spiritual archery practice was blurred by Herogel, as he tended to own the successful shootings to the work of spirit. So how did the body function in reaching the spiritual state, or in what way was the Zen spirit was bodily grasped? By examining the narrative of the body in Herogel's writings and understanding the art of archery as a form of embodied skill, I will interrogate the understated function of the body in grasping and transmitting Zen Buddhism, particularly in a cross-cultural setting, and the corporeality that lies at the center of the so-called Zen or Japanese spirituality promoted by D.T. Suzuki. Neither the art of archery, theoretically underpinned by Zen Buddhism, nor the Zen Buddhism practically represented as a performance of archery is self-sufficient. The association between Zen and archery is rather a late artificial construct. It was not until the early modern period, that is the Tokugawa period from 1603 to 1867, that the procedures and techniques of archery started to be highly codified and formalized, and still be connected with the philosophy of Zen Buddhism. After witnessing the official disfavor caused by the decline of the samurai or warrior class in the early Meiji period, that is from 1868 to 1912, the practice of martial arts, including archery, revived in the 1920s when the discourse of Japaneseness featured by Zen Buddhism thrived. This led to the popularity of explaining archery by using Zen terminology in the archery community since the 1920s. It was in this general context in Japan that Herogel started to learn archery under Awa Kenzo. Awa rose to fame nationwide in the early 20th century by manifesting his archery techniques in several competitions and become a prominent figure in Japanese archery community. He established the quasi-religious archery organization Daisha Dokyo, which means teaching of the great way of shooting, in 1927, and broadly adopted religious terminologies in his archery teachings. However, the philosophical sources of Awa's archery teachings were multiple and complicated, replete with not only Zen philosophy, but also sorts of Confucianism and Shintoism. Notably, Awa Kenzo never studied and practiced Zen Buddhism, nor did he approve of understanding archery practice specifically as an approach to Zen Buddhism. Instead, Awa Kenzo tended to understand archery purely as a way of self-cultivation, in accordance with the contemporary tendency of transforming the category of religion to an equivalence of moral education. This fact goes against the impression outside Japan that Japanese archery is a form of Zen meditation, thanks largely to Herrigel's writings. In fact, Herrigel's understanding of archery as a way towards Zen derived from D.T. Suzuki, especially his Zen Buddhism and its influence on Japanese culture, which was published in 1938 and later developed into the more famous and influential book Zen and Japanese Culture, which was published in 1959. Suzuki's writings amplify the interdependence between Japanese arts and Zen Buddhism, and further confirms the constructed dualism between East and Western culture, such as he claimed that Eastern culture is intuitive, whereas Western culture is logic and discursive. This construct was inherited also by Herrigel in his understanding of Zen and archery, particularly that his understanding that experiencing one of the Japanese art was the only way for a Western outsider like himself to penetrate, quote, penetrate into the realm of spiritual life, unquote. Therefore, there exists a rupture in Herrigel's practical experience of Zen and his later intellectual reflection on them. On the one hand, the bodily practice of archery under the instruction of Awa Kenzo, who did not necessarily agree to interpret archery as a form of Zen art, provided him with a preliminary somatic perception of Zen. On the other hand, Suzuki's predominant elaboration on the association between Zen and Japanese art was the exclusive Japanese intellectual source that Herrigel could only refer to and rely on to interpret his bodily perception of Zen. And Suzuki particularly concludes the Zen in the art of archery, as he wrote, as becoming one with the perfecting of his technology. He wrote in the foreword of the art of archery. In the case of archery, the hitter and the hit are no longer two opposing objects, but are one reality. The archer ceases to be conscious of himself. This state of unconsciousness is realized only when completely empty and rid of the self, he becomes one with the perfecting of his technical skill. So there is in it something of a quite different order which cannot be attained by any progressive study of this art. Suzuki's Suzuki's comments provided a new entrant to understanding the spiritual Zen in the art of archery. That is, in-body skill. The body is not only function as a communicative medium in the process of learning archery in Hirago's experience, because Hirago himself is could not fully understand Japanese and he could not speak Japanese. So the body is the only transmission tools for him and for him to learn archery from the instructor Abba Kenzo. And the body is also the experiencing subject and the experienced object. There are some other sources about Hirago's experience. If you want to learn more about the historical context of Hirago's times, and you can refer to this Shot in the Dark, Japan, Zen and the West, in which there are so many details about how Japanese scholars and Hirago constructed the art of archery, the art of archery as a Zen product. And for more historic development of the art of archery itself, you can also refer to this armed martial arts of Japan, swordsmanship and archery. Tim Ingalls distinguished between technology and skill. One of the main distinctions lies in that the skilled practice is subject-centered. The sensorial acuity and the somatic dexterity, especially the coordination between perception and action in relation to a given environment, take up a core role in craftsmanship. In contrast, the rise of the modern concept of technology caused the marginalization of the human corporeal subject from the center, or quote, from the center to the periphery to the productive process, unquote. In mechanical manipulation, the subject only becomes the operative that merely execute mechanically and repetitively the predetermined procedures according to the separate principles and rules that could be rationalized and externalized from the productive process per se. In short, skill, quote, places the subject at the center of activity, whereas technology affirms the independence of production from human subjectivity, unquote, and caused the separation between the controlling mind and the subservient body, the subject of design and execution, and the discorporate real agency and the physical object. So by re-examining the notion of skill, Tim Ingalls elevates the bodily subject, or rather the non-duality of the body and mind, back to the center of the productive process. So in light of Ingalls' discussion of skill, I understand Zen in the art of archery as a form of embodied knowledge and stress the corporeality in the nature of so-called Zen spirituality. The body functions as a primary site of both knowing how to act skillfully and acting skillfully, and the two processes are one and the same process in a skilled practice. According to Hirago, one of the major tasks in his archery training was to eliminate the corporeal resistance in the process of drawing the bow and loosening the arrow. It took him a long way to accustom his body to the heavy archery tools and to make the tools, the archery tools, the unified parts of the acting body and vice versa, making his body become one with the archery tools. The acting body is not the controlled subject that executes the predetermined procedures according to the controlling mind and the separate knowledge, but function as an intrinsic component of the integral process of knowing and acting, in contrast to shooting with a gun, in which process the essence action is to pull the trigger. Shooting with archery tools, especially the Japanese archery tools, which is said to be the longest in the world, with a length of 230 centimeters, require the inner force engendered by influence physical movement and the the intimate coordination between different somatic modalities and between the body and the tools, and also the seamless interplay between perception and action. And this is exactly the answer for Herogle's confusion that, as he confessed, why his proficient experience of shooting with a rifle gun could help nothing with mastering Japanese archery, even though they were both shooting sports. The cross line in that the later is a practice of skill, which is bodily subject centered, and thus, whereas the former is akin to the discorporeal manipulation of technology. In short, in the art of Japanese archery, the corporeality of the acting subject is much fundamental and essential, by no means beside the point. Tim Ingo also contends that at the heart of the skill lies the intimate coordination of the movement of the practice attention to others with his own bodily movements in the world, namely the interplay of the perception and action in relation to the surroundings. And this is also a crucial point in the practice of archery. The archer takes action upon seeing the target. Herogel did not discuss this interplay between perception and action in terms of archery, but in his discussion in the art of swordsmanship, yet he stressed the striking resemblance between the experiences of master archery and master swordsman. It is evident that he also considered it the key to the spiritual accomplishment of archery and all other forms of Zen art. As he notes, when someone doing the swordsmanship, he sees and feels what is going to happen at the same moment. He has already avoided its effect without being a hair's breadth between perceiving and avoiding. This then is what counts a lightning reaction, which has no further need of conscious observation. The coordination of perception and action pinpoint the state where, in between the concrete act of invasion and thrust in the face of an opponent, there exists no even the slightest interstice, that is a hair's breadth, so that the practitioners of Zen arts take place, so that the Zen performance take place spontaneously and intuitively. In other words, perception and action are one and the same process. And as Herogel proclaimed, his discussion on this interplay between perception and action in swordsmanship was derived from the Japanese Zen master Takuan Soho, or precisely from Suzuki's translation of Takuan Soho's writings. Suzuki also discussed at length in Zen and his influence on Japanese culture that about the immovable intelligence of Takuan. This is a state of the ever-floating, unfettered, and completely free mind which stops at or fixed to nowhere and thus exist and function everywhere. For Suzuki, this is the spiritual state featured by the Zen principle of no-mindedness. However, it is also an embodied state where there is no interspace between the very moment of perceiving the opponent's sword and taking action of seizing the enemy's own sword and turn it around and strike him with it. there is no interstice in between the perception of the sword of the opponent and the action that the swordsman takes, as there is no space for any intellectual activities of thinking about the way to react. Rather, the swordsman responds immediately and spontaneously. So I'm sorry, I made okay, I've just, so I'm going to finish my representation by that, in concluding that the corporeality by this sentence, by this paragraphs extracted from the Zen writing, there are two kinds of discipline, the one in ultimate reason and the other in technique. The first is as aforesaid to reach the ultimate reason of things where there are no scheduled regulations directing your action. There is just one mind which goes on its own way, but the mastery of technical detail is also necessary. Both forms of disciplines are needed. They are like two wheels of cart, which means you can also see that corporeality and spirituality are also two wheels of cart of Zen art. Thank you.
Thank you, Johan. Thank you for your presentation. I appreciate this kind of historical overview of the ways like the disciplining of the body and this in archery is kind of imbued with Zen understanding over time, and the kind of different writers and actors that are responsible for this transformation. I think that's yeah, the approach to literature is an interesting approach to look at this. We'll just wrap that up saying like really kudos to the organizers for selecting these presentations. I think they're really in conversation with each other. The things that Johan has raised, but all the presenters, the ways that bodies kind of act as communicative mediums, but also the ways like boundaries between the body acting, the objects or the materials being acted upon, and then the environment surrounding the bodies are kind of all blurred in the 4 ritual performances that these speakers are talking about. And we'll open it up to question period now. So feel free to raise your Zoom hand, type your questions into the chat. I can start with one if we don't have any. Let's see here. Anything in the chat? Okay. I'll start with a question just while everyone's brainstorming. I'll start with a question for David. I'm just interested in the specific body movements that are part of these performances and the kind of reception in the audience. So you note that the audience is encouraged to move to this front of the space for conversion. And then you talk about Sundays, like really exaggerated movements. But what is the audience doing aside from shouts and prayers? Like what are their bodies doing? How are they moving? Do they come into contact with each other? And how is this inner belief or the conversion expressed? Is Sunday like, or these preachers, are they telling a story, like an animated story of faith? Are they putting hands on? Just like more details of what's actually happening with the bodies.
Of course. So as you might have seen from some of the pictures earlier, the audience was really packed into these spaces. And so they're coming into close contact with one another. There is seating and people do sit for a good amount of it, but if there's a certain point that people start to feel really, that really resonates with them emotionally, they may stand up. They will stand up to sing and in prayer. There were occasions where they'd hold hands like as they'd pray, but especially with Amy Semple McPherson's revivals, as she was in the Pentecostal movement, the body was very active there. I don't know if you're familiar with Pentecostal worship services, but people run down the aisles, they fall to the ground with whatever they believe that their belief of the Holy Spirit is moving them to do. It's a very active form. And so we see that in Amy Semple McPherson's very readily. Billy Sunday is doing that himself to a lesser extent. He's running around the stage. I've seen so many critics commenting about how many kind of steps he must go in or laps he takes around the stage. But the audience themselves for Moody's revivals tend to be a lot more stagnant, of course, standing up and sitting down, and coming to the front. They'd often in Moody's revivals have like a separate room as well that they might move to fill out those inquiry cards, to give their information to missionaries to follow up with, and which separates them out and kind of creates a social pressure of, do you want to kind of follow them to that new space? Do you want to go and see what that's like? Element of mystery there.
Great, thank you. Oh, Ellen, I see you. Go ahead.
Well, thank you. First of all, just thanks to all the presenters. Those were all wonderful, interesting presentations. But my questions, I have several questions, I guess, for Rodrigo. I'll try and keep them concise. I was really, really interested in your presentation for many reasons. But okay, so a couple of questions. First, you discussed how the depictions of the rituals that engage with cannibalism, how those are contested sources, because they're all produced by Europeans, some of whom never even set foot in Brazil. So I was wondering if contemporary Indigenous communities, if they have any feedback about those images, what they say their rituals were at that time. So that's question number one. Question number two, you showed pictures of the Asajabas in different museums, one in Copenhagen and one in France, I believe. I was curious if there's been any repatriation efforts to have those artifacts returned to the communities, and if there's an issue of a provenance there, if museums, because of how these groups have been homogenized, if museums are keeping them under the guise of not knowing where the original communities are. And then thirdly, my question is about you talked briefly about the revitalization and the resurgence of featherwork in contemporary Indigenous communities. And that made me think of the proclivity that settler states have to appropriate Indigenous cultures as a sort of common heritage of the nation state. And I know that obviously in Brazil, in like carnival outfits, there's so much sort of feather work that sort of mimics these traditions, but in this homogenizing, commercializing way that speaks to like a general Brazilian heritage rather than specific Indigenous heritages. And I was wondering if you could speak like directly on that, if there is that appropriation of this feather work in like the general Brazilian national identity.
Wow, yeah, that like really deep, and I could like speak for many hours about the matter. Thank you so much, Ellen, for your questions. I will try my best to be concise, like to bring like concise answers. So the first question was about how the contemporary communities are providing feedback, if they are interested in debating these matters about the stereotypes of cannibalism specifically. About this regards, I don't have like a specific answer, but I would say I will take another turn to answer you. Since the 2000s, there is like an insurgent movement in the contemporary arts in Brazil called the Indigenous Brazilian Contemporary Art Movement, AIC in Portuguese, AIC, Arte Indígena Contemporânea in Portuguese. So this is a movement that is reasserting these narratives from the Indigenous people's perspective in contemporary times. So what I know that they are doing is in terms of talking about the anthropophagic subjectivity in a broader sense, because like, I don't know if you guys know, like, but in Brazilian national narratives and cultural movements, in different moments of history, we had this idea of cultural appropriation regarding the Tupinambá anthropophagic rituals in a symbolic sense, in a metaphorical sense. So like in the first time that this was done in a post-colonial setting was through the modernist movement of the Modern Week of São Paulo in 1922, where the idea of cultural cannibalism took place, and the elites that were hires of the plantations were trying to change these paradigms, these national paradigms related to the indigenous nations in Brazil. And they created this idea of cannibalistic culturalism, in which is a metaphor to assimilate the foreigners and you know, like cultures that are participating in the build of the national narratives in Brazil, because Brazil has always been a transcultural nation. The very idea of nation comes with colonialism. So before colonization, we didn't have these divisions between nations and the territories. The maps were totally different, the perception of geography and all this stuff. So then, like after that, in the 70s, the Tropicalia movement also reassimilated the idea of anthropophagic subjectivity to introduce counterculture movements worldwide that were happening, like the psychedelic movement, Woodstock, punk. So all these cultural countercultures that were happening worldwide were assimilated by the Tropicalia movement and by the Brazilian conceptual art. So yeah, sorry, I don't know if I am going too deep, but I'm trying to, you know, like contextualize how this legacy was assimilated by Brazilian culture. And so now the AIC, the indigenous contemporary artists, are trying to take back these narratives of cultural assimilation, and they are reasserting their own voices and their own cosmovisions in this idea of anthropophagy. So this is a movement that is happening regarding this anthropophagic legacy, let's say. But about the depictions itself of the stereotypes, I don't know necessarily what they say. I'm still like, I want to interview some contemporary indigenous artists. I work mainly with urban indigenous artists, so they have also a different perception of cosmovisions and tradition. But I will answer more. I will answer faster the other questions. The second question related to repatriation. I know that for a long time, the Tupinambá of Olivença, so the name of the contemporary Tupinambá descendants is Tupinambá of Olivença. Like I will write down in the chat, Olivença. They live in the south of Bahia, in the northeast of Brazil, in a region called Serra do Padeiro. And they have resisted there since colonial times. And they have always tried to challenge the hegemonic structures. So that the very idea of the Sojabas remanifesting in the material world brings back a sense of ecology, for example, because they are also bringing back wild animals that were no longer participating in their communities. So they believe this, the remanifestation of the Sojabas are part of this ecological balance as well. And therefore, this would always be important for their culture, like the remanifestation of this featherwork practice. And they have been listening to these entities and their beliefs and their knowledge throughout their dreams. So the Sojabas always resisted there, going beyond this rigidity of national standards and repatriation and stuff like that. But so things really got heated on in the 2000, in the year 2000, because there was a celebratory exhibition for the rediscovery of Brazil. So 100 years of the discovery of Brazil by the Portuguese colonizers. They were able to bring back one of these assojabas from the Parisian collection. I forgot the name of the museum, Quarry, I think, museum, yeah. And this was the only time, if I am not wrong, that one of these assojabas that are kept sealed in these collections in Europe could be displayed in Brazil. And then the Tupinambá of Olivença went to São Paulo, where the exhibition was taking place, and they manifested their indignation with this. And they asked for repatriation of their ancestors, because in their rituals, in their tradition, they believe they should bury, like they believe they are kind of like bodies, right? Like they are dead bodies right now. They are no longer alive, like. But at the same time, it's really intriguing, because then like they couldn't get the repatriation, but the Série Tupinambá went to the Parisian Museum after this debates. They granted permission to her to access the collection, and then she could kind of listen. She says in her speeches that she could listen her ancestor, like a feminine ancestor, that told her about the technique. That's how she was able to remanifest the Gerere technique. So there is also the sense of nonlinear times, and how entities that allegedly are from the past, they are actually in the spiritual world, that they were able to talk with her. So the repatriation didn't become any longer the issue, because she gave an interview recently that she also said she believes now the European collections should keep the ancient assojabas as kind of like adapt, as they should preserve them now, and because she could listen to how to remanifest them, so the entities are alive again for her and for the Tupinambá for Olivença people. And so just like to wrap up, you were also questioning me about the carnival appropriation of the work, and how this is kind of like a Brazilianist signifier. I could like also take a lot of different paths to answer you, but it's a really tricky question, because I also love carnival, and I love what represents carnival, like what carnival represents like for Brazilian culture. And it's kind of it can be said that it's also religious in a sense, right? Like it's part of our religion paradigm. It's a counter narrative of our religion's tradition. It's part of a Christian tradition in Brazil as well, of liberation, right? After the Quaresma, I forgot how to say Quaresma in English. Do you know? Because your mother is Brazilian, right?
The word is familiar, and I also don't know.
Okay, but yeah, like so I think like to make it short, I think it can be said that it's kind of like a subjectivity, a metaphor as well of this continuity of a tradition, right? Like a symbolic tradition regarding feather work. So it's kind of like an allegory. Is for me, carnival is more in the allegorical instance rather than in the spiritual sense regarding the feather work practice. But somehow it's enacting depending on the context, it's enacting also spiritual instances. But in the past, feather work was also a signifier of Brazilianness, and therefore, like the very idea of naming people as Brazilians was a way to erase indigeneity. So yeah, it's really complicated. I could keep talking, but I hope I could provide some insights.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. I knew it would be complicated, but thank you for your insight. And if you have any recommendations, I'll send you an email later. Okay.
Great, thank you.
All right. I know some people have to leave right at 4, so we have time for one more question. Professor Cohn, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, just thanks to everyone. A little overwhelmed by all the experiencing, kind of all of these different rituals, different time periods all at once. But what I wanted to say was kudos, especially to Johan for bringing in Tim Ingold and the kind of new materialist. You know, and I think it made me think of each of the papers and also Dr. Selby's presentation, you know, the material objects and, you know, I think it's really productive to think of them in an immaterialist sense. You know, how enacting ritual, what the materials do, the objects do in each case, you know, the feathered dress, for instance, you know, just I wear a kippah too, you know, even just that is a material object that's part of what's happening in the performance of it. You know, in Quebec, of course, this is a kind of pushback against the performance of a secular body, but so yeah, I guess it's probably not time for anybody to respond to that, but it's, for me, it's one of the resonances that emerged, and you sort of brought it to the fore by bringing that up. So thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I have a couple more questions, but I think for Johan and Mariangela, but I think I'll email you with my questions because you just raised some really interesting, provoking thoughts. And well, that's the end of our panel. I'm going to just pass it back to our organizers for like 1 more minute, if you can hang on. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Ali.
Yes, thank you very much, Ali, for being such a wonderful moderator. Claps for you. And to all of our panelists. And yes, it is now 4:01, so that concludes today's event and also concludes this year's AGIC. So we would like to take a moment to sincerely thank everyone who contributed to both events for Religion Performed, to our faithful organizing committee, which consists of me, Katrina, Lou, Tara, and McAllister. Thank you to all of them. To our keynote speakers, our presenters, and our moderators, thank you for essentially building this conference with us. And some key people from the Department of Religions and Cultures, Professor Cohn, Chair of the Department, Munit Merid, and past AGIC chairs, Jordan, Isabel, Colby, Ali. Thank you so much for your trust and for your support.
And last but not least, thank you, participants, everyone who was a part of this. It's been a pleasure to learn with you. And if you missed any parts of the conference or know someone who might be interested, as mentioned, we'll have recordings up on our YouTube channel as soon as possible. It will come. So please stay tuned for that. And on that note, we'll wish you a beautiful rest of the week, and we'll hope to see you next year for AGIC 2024. So thank you so much to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.